Hello and welcome to today's A-Team group webinar on FINRA CAT case, what to expect when giving regulators full access to your customer and account data. My name's Sarah Underwood. I'm an editor at A-Team Group and I'll moderate today's webinar. Our expert speakers today are Marissa Billingsley, Senior Product Manager at Apax, Denise Garrett, Executive Director, Head of Americas Operations Compliance at Morgan Stanley, Jacqueline Von Moore, Vice President at Goldman Sachs, and Peter Garlon, Founder and CEO at NTR Financial Services. I'll ask them all to introduce themselves in just a couple of minutes. But first, I just wanted to say, to make the most of our webinar from your own perspective, just to the right of your video screen, you'll see two panels, one for polls, one for questions. We'll be running 3 polls during today's webinar, and you'll be able to see those in that channel. So please do vote when the polls are put up. It'd be nice to get your reaction to some of our questions. In the Q&A panel, you can write any questions you would like me to put to the speakers. Please put them in there as often as you like. We'll take the questions as we go along. So use that box for that, the other one for polls. I'll let you know when polls are coming up. Okay, enough of me and let me come to our speakers. Marissa, please tell us a little bit about yourself and your involvement in the SEC's Consolidated Audit Trail Customer and Account Information System, or CAT case as it's more normally known now.
Sure. Good morning, everybody. My name is Marissa Billingsley, and I am a product manager at Apax. We are a correspondent. We are a clearing firm, and we are doing case report on behalf of ourselves and some of our correspondents. Additionally, I've been working on CAT case since at least the first tech spec was published, and I'm on the SEC Advisory Committee.
Thank you very much indeed. Over to you, Denise.
Hi, I'm Denise Garrett. I head infrastructure compliance here at Morgan Stanley, and I've been here for almost 20 years. And I have been involved in the Consolidated Audit Trail since its implementation in 2010. I used to be part of the development advisory group, so I thankfully know everything there is to know about CAT, and I'm taking more of a step back and helping spread the knowledge throughout the firm. But I've been involved with 2A, 2B, 2C, 2D, and now with CAIS.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed. And Jackie, over to you.
Sarah, my name is Jackie Van Moore, and as you mentioned, I'm working at Goldman Sachs on our upcoming regulatory operations team. And to get it out of the way, everything I say in today's webinar is my opinion and does not reflect the opinion of Goldman Sachs. I've been working on the Consolidated Audit Trail for the last 4 years, so working on the implementation of ours as a firm and helping to build the 2A, 2B, 2C, and now 2D and 2E go lives.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. And Peter, coming to you.
I'm the founder and CEO of NTR, as Sarah mentioned. I started NTR 20 years ago. We're a software vendor. We focus on the validation, correction, and reporting of regulatory data for firms. We have a number of clients doing CAT reporting with us, and we've been sort of working on that for a number of years. And CAIS is an extension of that, and especially the upcoming CAIS requirements. So we're sort of working across firms on these initiatives.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. And let's start with an audience poll and see how people did in the first phases. The question is, how difficult was it for your organization to achieve compliance with phase 1 of CAIS? So while you choose your answer to that particular question, let me come to Jackie to set the scene and tell us what the first phase of CAIS required and how successfully financial firms responded to the requirement.
Thanks, Sarah. So the initial phase of CAIS reporting customer and account information systems reporting went live in April 2021, and it required large broker dealers to begin reporting a limited set of information to the CAT customer and account database. It required large broker dealers to report their firm designated IDs, which otherwise known as FDIDs, reported on any order and transaction events that have an associated large trader ID to it. And it required a limited set of information for those FDIDs. It's really the FDID, any LTIDs or ULTIDs, the FDID date, which is similar to the account open date, the LTID effective date, and a couple other fields. And then if the FDIDs are ended or if the LTID becomes no longer associated to the account, that is to be reported as well. So this really established the initial reporting stream of customer information to the CAT, which is separate from reporting to the order and transaction CAT database. And I think overall firms were largely successful, but we'll see how firms felt with our poll.
Okay, fantastic. Denise, what would you say there in terms of what was done and how successful it was?
I would agree with everything Jackie said. I think one thing to just layer onto that was in 2020, I want to say December 2020 to be exact, there was an OC alert from the SEC as it pertains to large trader obligations for firms. So in anticipation of that, firms such as ours did do a lot of work around large trader ID. We did self-testing to make sure that our oversight of large trader ID and our record keeping around large trader ID was in place. And that was all with anticipation of what Jackie said about the rollout earlier this spring. And I think that was a good opportunity for us to be in the right spot for this first phase of CAIS, and I would say that our firm has successfully achieved compliance with it. However, there was definitely a lot of work in the background to make sure that our large trader ID program was operating and it was properly tested.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Can we see those poll results then, please? See how everybody in our audience got on. Okay, Jackie, would you like to comment on that? Does that sort of seem how you might expect?
Yeah, I think it is. There were challenges with implementing it, so it was difficult to do, but I think most firms were able to meet that challenge and meet with the compliance deadline in April.
Okay, that's great. Let's take another audience poll. We don't usually run them quite so swiftly as this, but let's see how people are feeling about phase 2. So the question this time is, how difficult will it be for your organization to achieve compliance with phase 2 of CAIS? So while you answer that question, let me come to Marissa, if I may, to talk about the next phase of CAIS. When will it come into force? What types and sizes of firms will have to report under the phase? And what are the expanded reporting requirements? That's an awful lot.
So I'll start by saying it's coming quickly. People think 2022 and they think it's far away, but it's not. It's so soon. It's coming so fast. And like, if we're not thinking about it now, we're already late, really, I think. And so who needs to report? Everybody, every industry member that has a CAT obligation has a CAIS obligation. That means that small firms who have not even started transaction reporting yet will also have the same exact obligation at the same time. And the data that we have to report, I know we'll go into more details later, but it needs to be for every customer that you get an order from starting in January. So the reporting doesn't happen until July, but we have to start reporting on customer activity from January.
Okay.
So that's a lot to unpack.
Yeah, it certainly is. Yeah. And Jackie, what would you add there?
Yeah, I'd echo everything Marissa said and add in that the scope of reportable accounts will expand for this phase. Currently, firms are only required to report any accounts with LTID associations. However, as Marissa alluded to, beginning in July, we'll all be required to report for any FDIDs, which are accounts or relationship IDs that have been reported on any order transaction events to CAT, which is a much wider scope and will bring in a lot of additional information for both accounts and any authorized traders and account holders. So much more information and many more accounts.
Okay, hold your breath. Let's see the poll results, if we may. There we go. Marissa, what do you say to that?
Yeah, I agree. This is going to be a big lift, and the spec kind of keeps evolving on us, right? Where we're not finalized on everything that needs to be reported, or what needs to be reported seems to kind of over ask what other regulatory rules require in terms of customer and account information. So there's a lot that we need to still process and get through before we're going to get to July, and the time just keeps on ticking.
Absolutely. So let's spend the rest of this webinar trying to help people who are obviously finding it very difficult, particularly compared to the first phase. So coming back to you, Jackie, if I may, what are the additional data elements required for reporting? You mentioned them, but can you just sort of ring fence them for us.
Yeah, so we'll walk through some specifics. And one of the big challenges is with how the spec is designed is that you have to report information at both the FDID or the account level and also at the customer level. And not all firms maintain this information at the customer level. It's kept at the account level, which makes it a challenge to report. So we'll break it into two categories. First, the account level, so this is the overall FDID level, or in many cases accounts. There are specific account type values that they've laid out in the specification that you would report for the account name, and if there's a prime broker ID, a depository ID, or clearing broker, those have to be identified at the account level, along with branch office CRD, registered rep CRD, and at least one address, but up to 4 addresses for the account. And then from there, we get into the customer information, where we have to report both account holders and authorized traders. And at that level, you need some sort of what they're calling a transformed ID or TID. And this, for a natural person, would be a social security number, ITIN, that is transformed for reporting, an EIN for an entity, or if it's a foreign ID, they have a few different values that could be reported, like a foreign tax ID, an LEI, or a couple of other alternatives. And for the customer, you also have to identify what that customer's role on the account is, if they are an account holder or an authorized trader, and when they got that date. So when was this customer added to the account, and if that is ended, when was it ended? And then further information on that customer would be the name, year of birth if it's a natural person, address if it's maintained at the account level. You can report 1, but up to 4 addresses. And then there are several different attributes that you can report in the customer type, like if it's accredited, advisor, control person, employee of the reporting firm, a foreign customer, or an employee at another broker dealer. And then another entity field would be LEI if you have it.
Okay. Oh, Denise, what would you add to that? That's a lot of information. I think one of the things that's of interest here is that is a lot of information. What is the challenge there, in terms of sort of getting all that together?
I mean, I know we're going to talk about onboarding a little later on, but to what Jackie added at the account level, what's interesting for large institutional houses such as Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley, account level isn't the only level that we have, right? So Morgan Stanley has a wealth management arm, and that tends to be very account driven, such as, if you have an investment advisor, when you place your trade, it's at an account level. But if you have a investment advisor that manages accounts and has trader discretion on all of those accounts, it'll be more of a portfolio level trade. On the institutional side, that's pretty much the entire model, where we have order placers on behalf of customers of those order placers. So we have to layer on top of the account level information the understanding that we need to also report order placer level detail as well. So that added a big layer of complexity, and that's why I'm not surprised to see the results that you got from the poll, because going into all of this, we had to reevaluate how our hierarchy around customer structure is, so we can provide that level of detail that Jackie just so successfully walked us through.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. And let's run our third and final poll for today. The question this time is, what are the challenges of sourcing and reporting sensitive customer data at your organization? And on this occasion, please feel free to tick as many boxes as are appropriate for you. And while you do that, let me come back to Marissa to talk about the challenges and solutions of sourcing and reporting sensitive customer information, and what kind of issues these challenges raise in terms of reference data security and its implications for firms and service providers.
There's so much there. So first, everybody needs to understand all those attributes that Jackie laid out, and they're detailed, and they're like little nuggets in each of those that you need to unpack and understand. So do you have every authorized trader's year of birth? Like we're going to need that now. Is that something you even capture? Do you have an authorized trader's social security number? Do you have a foreign person's government issued ID? That's not necessarily, going back to KYC, that's not something you necessarily capture today. And so how are you getting this? What are your deltas? And then assuming you're not the ones that are doing the actual case reporting yourselves and you're working with a vendor, how do you transmit this data that is so sensitive to another party? Like these are the things that we're trying to figure out now. And there's just more change on the horizon.
Okay, when you say there's more change on the horizon, everybody has mentioned or that there is change to come. Do you know what changes are expected in this particular space?
So the industry is pushing back a lot on things like authorized trader, right? So today, if you are a retail customer and you've authorized somebody to trade on your behalf, they do not necessarily, most firms do not consider that that authorized trader is your customer, is their customer. But the SEC and the rule says that they are your customer. So how do you reach out to those people? How do you capture that information? And now you're expanding your PII risk yourselves because you're capturing information for people that you do not consider your customers. So this is continued advocacy and ongoing conversations that the industry with SIFMA and FIF and others have been trying to have with the SEC, but time keeps on ticking and we haven't gotten to any resolution point yet.
And that makes differences to your implementation, presumably, in exactly what you're doing.
Absolutely. I mean, so as a clearing firm, I don't have this data. I don't have a place necessarily to get this data from an introducing broker, and I don't have a way to store it, let alone get it to my reporting agents.
Right. Yeah, as you say, time is ticking, but there's a lot to do in that time. Okay, coming over to you, Jackie, on the same question. Where do you see the challenges and solutions here around sensitive customer data?
I think Marissa really hit it on the head with a lot of that. I think the one thing I would really stress is even if you ask for a piece of information, you still need to build somewhere to store that information and keep it and then eventually report it. So there's a lot of different steps that go into collecting additional information outside of the outreach itself. And then even on top of that, I know we'll get into this a bit more later, but accessing the data internally for whichever team you'll have internally running this. As we've looked internally, as this is very sensitive data, we've identified that it's very limited in how many people can have access to it for daily review. So I think that's something that firms should think about as well, not just the build, but also, as we all know, things go wrong when you're reporting. So who will have access to actually look at the underlying data and resolve any issues?
Okay, that's great. Let's see what our audience thinks in terms of the difficulties. Yeah. Age-old problem, whatever. I think we're talking about the numerous data silos, gaps in the data. Yeah. Okay, Denise, what would you say about those results?
So, it's interesting. One of the things that we came up with that, we recently just came up with is the process around onboarding and the sensitive information. So here's a good example that might be helpful to others. So when we onboard, we do have a client reference data system, and then you take on all the information from the client. It then goes through, like an engine that then pumps it downstream, and it populates it into various different reference databases. But then one of the things that we learned, and this is a perfect example with tax ID, that based off of the type of client you are, right, you could be a global client and you might not have a U.S. tax ID, there's a whole area within our firm that refreshes that information. But that information is managed in their own area, and it doesn't feed back up to the original customer reference database. So it's like a one-way communication, and it needs to be two-way. So even though that information is fully managed and clean through a tax team, and they do it on behalf of the entire firm, both retail and institution, it's not necessarily feeding up to these other systems because they didn't need that information past onboarding, right? So now when we build out CAIS, the answer is, well, we're always going to golden source systems. That's number one. You have to go to golden source systems. But now we're questioning, well, is that tax system a golden source system, or should it still be that client reference data and we have two-way communication because more people access that system? So to me, I know it sounds like it's a huge hurdle, but to me, I'm like, that's something that if this didn't happen, I don't think many of us would have ever realized that disconnect. And it's not like we're out of compliance to have that disconnect, but it's a disconnect that when you look at it, you say, you know what, it makes sense to have two-way communication. And so that's just, one of the, an answer as it pertains to this sensitive information, because it's like, where should it live? Who should touch it? But should you at least have some entitlement rights in another system so that, other areas of the firm, based off of their roles and responsibilities, can have access to it as well?
Okay, thank you. Peter, just as a matter of interest, as a vendor, when you're talking to numerous customers, are data silos a big deal for them? Is that, would you agree with the poll?
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely. The silos are a big problem. And the other thing we see a lot of is, as everybody's sort of moved to the cloud, the encryption of this data becomes absolutely critical. You need to use it. And this kind of goes back to the access to the information question of who can access it and when they can access it. But you need it for certain processes unencrypted. But if you're looking at it from a vendor perspective, you really need to be storing this stuff encrypted.
Okay, fine. And staying with you indeed, Peter, what are the new exception management and correction processes of phase 2, and what will they mean for reference data and transaction reporting?
I think the uniqueness about this part of it is, this is exception management in relation to reference data, which exception management as a real-time process for reference data is kind of a new concept, right? Because most firms have pretty much lived with more of a quarterly review process, right? This brings the regulators right into that exception management process, where they're going to be giving you validation errors and material difference errors on a daily basis with a time window to clean those up. And what that really means for firms is you've got to have an infrastructure and a process in place for supporting that, which is going to be very different and very foreign in terms of what those correction processes probably look like today across firms.
Okay, that's great. Denise, what would you add there in terms of the correction processes?
So to add to what Peter said, it's, one of the things that you need to really implement is, I work off of examples, so I hope that's okay. So if you have a client that has an address or just a general GFC KYC field, they are going to fall under, like Peter said, some kind of like hygiene naturally, because we have to do it to meet those reg requirements, but it's not real time. So now you're working with teams when you get these exceptions that are really just data entry teams, but now you have to have a client outreach element. And yes, I do understand, if we have a mismatch with another firm, we're going to really have to build a process around what we want to do there. But what we're even seeing now in our own cleanup and preparation of case is it's unavoidable to not have some client outreach. So it's a matter of saying who owns that client outreach. You have your exception management teams, and then you have your operations teams that have those client relationships. And it's getting these people on board to say, okay, now you have a role. This is the SLA for you for your role, and this is what the resource need we predict will be. But again, we won't know until we're living and breathing it. So at times like this, it's budget season. We got to put that out there and say, hey, this is an anticipated ask, and this is what we're thinking now, and we have to plan for it. But it really is bringing a lot of teams that never really spoke to each other together, all to solve one problem.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much indeed. Let's take a quick break and answer a few audience questions if we can. Let me put this one to you first, Marissa. The panel mentioned data security. Please, can you say more about how firms should achieve this? Obviously, it's something people worry about a lot, but in this particular instance, how can people secure this personal data?
Like Peter said, I think it's all going to come down to encryptions and entitlements. So if you're capturing this data, make sure that it's locked down and it's not in some readable format in your systems. Make sure that it's not that not everybody in your firm is accessing the system. And then if you're transmitting it to another vendor for case reporting, how are you transmitting that? Like maybe you're going to do the encryption, transform that tax ID yourself, and send only that transformed ID to the vendor who's doing your case reporting, because it's just a huge area where you don't want to be sending out unencrypted or untransformed social security numbers, right? That just opens up a whole like crazy path of liability that we don't want to go down.
Okay, what would you say there, Denise? You're talking about the two systems that you're using and the double communication. Does that make it easy, difficult?
It makes it very difficult. So I'm definitely not as technical as Marissa, right? I'm more, I don't know, pie in the sky maybe, right? So, but I mean, the encryption piece, for me, the way I look at that, and I think Peter touched on it a little bit earlier, is how do we, I'm more concerned with when FINRA comes to us and asks us questions on encrypted data, how do I support that from a compliance perspective, right? So when they're asking certain questions around clients, do I have the right tools for my inquiry team to be able to answer those questions, or am I now forced to go to IT to de-encrypt? I mean, I don't even know if that's a word, de-encrypt, but I mean, that's kind of the struggle that we're seeing. So I think our IT team is able to figure out how to actually get it over in an encrypted, but when they come to us and ask questions on it, I'm concerned, how do we make it visible and we know who they're talking about so we can answer, and without having to bring these teams that normally do not interface or respond directly to regulators or even assist with inquiries, we have to have some kind of GUI, and we got to figure that out. And we don't have that yet, and that's something we're really starting to look at, and it's going to be a real struggle for firms.
Okay, thank you for that. And Jackie, a question for you. Please would the panel clarify why and how the LAI is used and how best we can source LAIs for CAT case? I think you mentioned that they weren't necessary, but is it best that people get them, use them? Will they be a requirement, do you think, at any point?
So currently the CAT rule only requires reporting the LEI if you already have it. So there's no requirement to go out and get it. And I don't think there's been any movement toward requiring it. The one case where it might be useful is for any foreign customers if you do not have another identifier to use for their transformed ID.
Okay, so for those of us who love the LAI, a place where thousands more will be issued, but not for everybody. Okay, thank you very much. And one more question. I'm going to come back to you first on this one, Denise, but everybody might like to chip in. What do the speakers expect the regulatory tolerance on data accuracy to be as the July 2022 phase of case comes into play?
I think there'll be tolerance. I'm fortunate because I look at both sides of the house, and I look at the institution and I look at the wealth side. The inquiries we're receiving to date on the 2A and 2B, we've had some really good dialogue with the regulator on explaining why we may have done what we did, if we miss the mark, where we're going to be with fixing that, and nothing, thankfully, has been of a grand scale. Nothing has been viewed in a way that it was manipulative in any manner, or a complete oversight on our part. So it's been a very good dialogue with the regulators, and they seem to be comfortable with the control framework that we have even implemented. So I think for the client reference data, there will be some leverage there. But again, it's going to be one of those things where it's going to be interesting when I see what Goldman Sachs has for the same client I have. Because for now, all I can do is take the information that I have in-house, clean it up as best as possible, make sure it's from golden sources, and make sure that teams are communicating so we can keep it clean. But if I have a client that comes in and gives me a profile of XYZ, but then Jackie has the same client, but her profile shows ABC, that's going to be very interesting, because it's saying that it's not necessarily my information is wrong and neither is hers, but why is it different? And I think that's something neither firm can prepare for until we see that. But I do think that FINRA has been very responsive, and as long as we're showing we're doing everything in a just and fair manner, they're definitely not enforcing at the level that they did when Oates was very mature. They understand this is still in its infancy stage.
Okay. And for the others, Marissa, would you agree with that? Do you see some tolerance in July?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that one of the interesting things about the ongoing dialogue is that they don't know what data they're going to get. They're asking for a lot. I don't think they know how they're going to use it yet. And so I think it's going to be a learning process for all of us together, where when we talk in hypotheticals, they understand a little bit. And when they see reality and then we have the same conversation, I think it's going to click at a different level.
Okay, that's fine. And Peter, what do you see out there? What are people expecting in a general sense?
Well, I think it was, when you look at the initial CAT reporting, the speed with which the regulators started in their reviews and the depth of those reviews was kind of surprising. I mean, it's a lot quicker, I think, than most firms were ready for. And I feel like I agree that there'll be a lot of tolerance and some tolerance around correcting the data, but the regulators, I see them just sort of sweeping this up in those review processes. And then this whole CAT data management framework and the controls and the processes around it, right? Because they're really very focused on the process. What are you doing to make sure this is running smooth? And that process is going to get swept up in the reviews. And I see that happening sooner rather than later.
Right. And Jackie, would you agree with some of these comments?
Yes, I would agree with it. I think it'll be more of a conversation right away, where when they do see discrepancies, they'll reach out and ask about it. And if you have a documented process and reasoning for why you're reporting a certain way, and if they disagree with it, they would likely just, ask for when can you change it and how are you working toward that? Because I know we've seen similar inquiries on the transaction reporting side, where they'll reach out with a question and then we'll talk it through and explain our process and reasoning for why we're reporting a specific way, and then go from there.
Okay. Okay, Peter, did you want to add something, or have you said what we wanted to say? You're fine. Good. Okay. Okay. Well, thank you for our questions from our audience, and let's get back to our questions. And coming back to you, Denise, considering everything that's been said already, what will the impact on onboarding and account management teams and KYC processes be with the arrival of phase 2? We've talked a little bit about this. Could you sort of bring it all together for us?
Yeah, I can definitely bring it together. So our onboarding teams, and I think a lot of firms have the same process, it's a combination of operations personnel and front office operations. And so what we're going to have to do a little bit more closely now is look at the case requirements versus the KYC requirements. And as I mentioned earlier, I was part of the DAG, so we really tried to push that the case reporting was really in line with KYC, so we weren't adding additional regulation on top of onboarding teams. But there is, when Jackie went through some of the fields, some of that stuff is not a KYC, GFC requirement. So you're going to have to map where you have a GYC, KYC requirement, and you're going to have to build out anything outside of that and make that part of your refresh, build your policies and procedures to highlight what your process is and what controls you have in place, and make sure that there's adequate supervision. So in this case, it would be a Series 99 supervisor that's responsible for the ops data intake, and then the CAT supervisor, which is a Series 24. So for the impact directly on onboarding and account management teams, it's really adding another layer of procedures over their functions today, and procedures that will be requested more frequently by the regulator. To Peter's point earlier, a lot of this work is going to come through the standard exam sweep process that the regulators do. So now these teams are going to be operating under procedures and supervisory oversight that will be more frequently handled over to the regulators and asked to be provided as evidence of supervision, a function that they haven't really received that type of scrutiny before in the past, at least not in the equity security space.
Right. Marissa, what would you say there about the impact?
Yeah, I mean, I think really Denise hit it all on the head. These are teams that have not really been part of a regulatory review process before, and all of a sudden they're going to need to be part of this process, and it's all new to them, and it's a new language, it's a new sense of urgency that it's different than what their day-to-day looks like today, and we can't even anticipate how much and what the ask is going to be. And then in terms of like specifics on KYC onboarding that are not covered, going back to like foreign customers, and we need a national issued ID now. And previously there were other ways besides a passport or a national ID that you could do for KYC, and there's a big delta there, and that has to be covered not just in your onboarding process, but in all the technology related to that process.
Okay, we're dealing with a monster here, it seems. But, that's great. And staying with you, Marissa, what special considerations are in place for clearing firms and correspondents?
So a lot of times, correspondents lean on the clearing firm as their source of data, and that's true for 90%. But what do we do when it's not true, right? So what do we do for like authorized trader information where as a clearing firm, that's not something that I've cared about before because that's a front office function. So we have to figure out, does the profile of each correspondent firm require authorized traders or support authorized traders? How do they capture that? How do they send it to us? Are they transmitting it? And then, in the reverse, if we're not doing CAT case reporting on their behalf, do they need information from us that we're typically not sending them so that they can facilitate case reporting themselves? So it's a two-way process, and it requires a lot of dialogue.
Okay, that's great. So Jackie, what would you add there?
I think Marissa really covered most of it, where it's two-way information sharing. But the only thing I would add is that for any correspondent firms, I would make sure both the correspondent firm and clearing firm both have to report separately. And in many cases, there are clearing firms reporting for their correspondents, but there are other cases where the clearing firms are not reporting. So really figuring out who's doing the reporting so each firm knows what the expectations are and has their reporting covered.
Okay, thank you. I've got rather a lot of audience questions coming in, so let's take another break and see what we can answer. And the first one, I'm going to put this one to you, Peter. Is there any similarity here to GDPR and CCPA regulations? Obviously, this is in relation to the privacy point. Does that come into?
No, I'm not. I don't have a good answer for that one. Unfortunately, we haven't out in that space yet.
Okay. Anybody else looked at this in comparison to other regs? Okay, so to whoever asked that question, we
can take it away though. Yeah.
Thank you. That would be great. Okay, next one. I can't see any references to providing birth date, SSN, and other information in the case text specs. Where can I see this? Open to all. Where are these pieces of information to be placed?
I can take that one.
Okay, thanks, Jackie.
So the date of birth itself is not required, but the year of birth is required on the natural person customer record. So if you do a search within the tech spec for a year of birth with no spaces in it, that will bring you to it. And then the SSN is part of the transformed ID record for natural persons. And so, but you will not report the SSN itself. You will have to first encrypt it into this transformed ID, which is what you will submit to CAT. And there are examples of that in the tech spec. I would search for the transformed ID file.
Okay, fine. And Denise, one for you. It uses an abbreviation RR, which I can't do, but maybe you can. So I'll read it to you and you tell me if we can answer this one right now. If not, we'll take it away and ask it another time. It asks, just shot off my page, but hang on a moment. That one seems to have disappeared momentarily. So let me come back to Jackie on another bit of this same question. I'll see if I can find the other one. When do we start reporting SSN and birth dates to CAIS?
This will be, the compliance date is July 11th. However, the production test environment will open in January. So you can start testing late January, and the production environment will open early in, I believe, late April. If your firm wants to go live early, or perhaps you want to slowly build up all of your case reports so you do not have to report them all on day one. However, it is required to begin reporting on July 11th, 2022.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Obviously, somebody had a change of mind on that question, but Marissa, let me come to you with another one. It asks, correspondent relationships with the clearing firms. Does this mean that the standard clearing firm agreements need to be modified?
I think that the clearing firm answer is probably very clearing firm specific. So I could say that I know Apex is offering a service to do case reporting on our correspondent's behalf, but that is a separate agreement, exclusive, not part of the current clearing firm agreement.
Okay. And Denise, one for you. In preparing for full case, what automation bottlenecks are you facing?
Well, we're very lucky. I mean, I think the biggest automation bottleneck that we're facing is this tax piece that I highlighted earlier. Being a part of the DAG, again, I sat in meetings every other week and starting in 2011 going through what this was going to look like. So we were able to take a lot of this stuff back and build more robust client onboarding systems in preparation of getting data more quickly and cleanly and already through a process that has more DQ controls. And we did that on both sides of the house. And that was really, a lot of it was stuff that people wanted to do, but when you have a regulatory push behind it, it makes it a little bit easier to get funding to execute upon it. But we did a lot of planning back in 2015 in preparation for today. So I think the automation bottleneck is really just around this tax ID, at least for my firm.
Okay. Anybody like to add further to that? Okay, let's come to another one. Coming back to you, if I may, Marissa, you've talked about areas that aren't completed. Can you name a few? And the question actually says, what parts of the case are not completed and how can we cope with them before July?
So I think, I guess not completed is probably a poor phrasing on my part, but it's just areas that are still contentious or, disputed between the industry and the SROs and the SEC. So really the biggest parts are around authorized traders and if they're your customers, because if you think about this overall, you generally know your beneficial owners on an account and you generally have that information, and it might be, slightly off if the golden source is not updated or something like that. But generally, when you look at the spec, you can say, okay, this seems like mostly, digestible, reportable information. But when you change the entire spectrum of that, you say now your authorized traders are your customers, that's just a complete minefield of data that's not captured today regularly and consistently across the industry. And so we've done a lot of industry education. The industry has done a lot of education to the SEC directly on why this is not really aligned with our current practices. And the progress and resolution is really slow and frustrating. So it's really still an open question that without a negative answer or without some sort of exemption or relief, we have to assume we will need to collect, report, and move forward with.
Right. Okay. So hence the need for some regulatory tolerance at least comes a day. Yeah. When things are coming in so fast. It reminds me of MiFID II very much. Peter, one for you, which you may like to answer. And this one says, and I think it's quite a recent thing, it says responsibility for personal data seems to be a moving target at the moment. How do you see this being resolved and who will be at fault if there is a data breach?
If you look at it from a vendor perspective, right, from a regulatory perspective, right, you're responsible for your regulatory reporting. There are, I look at it as more of a process, right? You're going to do everything you can to make sure that that data is secured, and the liability comes down to whether it's negligence and from a legal perspective, depending on the type of breach, right? If you've done your work, you've got all that data encrypted, the likelihood of a breach goes way down, and no one's going to be able to argue that you were negligent. It's really not clear, right? I mean, this is why the regulators have taken that Social Security data and had it transformed before they even take it in, right? That goes back to the origination of this. So it's kind of it's going to be an open question going forward.
Okay. Do you think there will be an answer to it before July?
I don't think there's a clear answer to who's liable in terms of the dissemination of that data. I don't think there is a clear answer, and I think that's why the regulators have gone with the encrypted approach to it.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. And Denise, one last question for you. Are there different reporting requirements for self-directed online firms versus more traditional full-service retail firms?
Yeah, there are different requirements between an institutional, and self-directed, I guess, versus a retail. When I say requirements, the requirements are both very similar. It's your trade flow and trade practices that differ, right? So in the case of a retail client, you do pretty much have a trade process by account. And therefore, you would have the trade upon order entry, you would have that FDID associated with that account, and then you would do an allocation to that account that matches the same, that FDID, and it's very STP and clean. On the institutional side, you have the order placer with an FDID, and then you have the trade flow go through, but you don't know exactly who the underlying client that order placer sent the order to until allocation, that order placer sent the order on behalf of until you get to allocation, and there you would have that account level detail there. So that's a big difference. Other differences are just the sophistication around the trading models. So you would have an ATS model in an institutional firm when you historically don't have an ATS model in a retail shop. You would have more complex strategies for options trading in an institutional shop than you would on a retail shop, right? So those are things that, although it's included in the same exact spec, there are elements of the spec that wouldn't necessarily pertain to a retail shop because of the nature of the business model. But I also did, if you don't mind, want to just touch upon what Peter talked about around the liability piece, right? So this is something that my firm has been very involved in, and it's around the CAT agreement liability limitation. So originally in the CAT agreement, the SROs were trying to limit their liability for a breach of that system to $500. And that's something that, the industry took, a lot of issue with, understandably so, because at the end of the day, what Peter was talking about is we can control what we can on our side of the house, but we can't control what they're doing with the information once we give it to them, and it shouldn't be our responsibility to do so. So this had really gone to the heads of our data security teams across both firms, as well as our data legal enterprise team, and they've worked intimately with SIFMA. So really just the other day, and I just want to read this. So SIFMA is still working with the Tech and Regulation Committee as well as with the commissioners, but really at the end of the day, it looks like the SEC is on the same page as we are, that this $500 limited liability is not an option. So you'll see more about that. That's news that's still in the making, and let's hope it goes our way. It's nothing official yet, but it's looking promising. So don't hold me that anything's quoted, but this is definitely looking promising, and we'll see something from SIFMA and the SEC soon. But it's very important to know we can only do so much on our side of the house. Once the information falls into the eyes of the arms of the regulator, there's limitations, and we need to work with the regulator, with our IT teams and their IT teams to protect that information. But we got to work together for that.
Okay, thank you very much for your questions, and thank you everybody for taking them on. We do have another couple, so I'll gather those up and send them to everybody. If I haven't answered your question, I hope we'll be able to do that offline. Okay, and coming back to you, Peter, can you talk about the implications of CAIS Phase 2 for other regulatory reporting obligations and surveillance programs?
Sure. The data that's in CAIS 2 is already embedded in other regulatory reports like blue sheets and LOPR reporting, right? The regulators have gotten a lot better over time at comparing the results of different reporting regimes, right? So I think when you look at the implications on those other reports, I think what this means is there's another touch point for them to embed more oversight on the other reportings. And when you get into, when you talk about the silos, right? And what do data silos mean? If those other reports are coming from silos which are different than the CAIS reporting, I think it's going to create some conflicts that are going to be pretty easy for the regulators to pick up on. And so what that really means is another layer of oversight on your other reports, which could create a lot of problems for firms if they're not synced up.
Okay. Now, Denise, what would you add to that in terms of the nasty mixture?
I totally agree, right? So we're talking about a transactional report that has an allocation element, right? And now you're going to start pulling in perhaps position reporting. So to Peter's point, yes, hopefully blue sheets will take a step back. They still have fixed income products, but at least that'll be used less frequently. But we will get more pressure as it pertains to LOPR, as it pertains to even the insight report and short interest reporting. And now if you overlay the proposal for a T+1 settlement, it really helps bridge the gap between your position reporting and now your transactional / allocation reporting, reg reports, and they'll be able to marry the two more closely. And, just taking a step back to what we talked about very early on in this discussion is we're dealing with different teams throughout the firm that historically never really had to talk to each other specific to a regulation, and now they'll have a regulation that's common amongst all teams, and that communication line always needs to be open.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. And coming to our last talking point for today, I'd like to ask all our speakers what broker-dealers should be doing now to prepare for a case phase 2. And Denise, would you like to kick off here?
Yes, so I like to say it's budget season, right? So get all the people with control over the checkbook in a room and explain what your challenges are to date, and do a best efforts of trying to figure out where the resource need is and where it should sit, and also take a best efforts at where STP can be improved, and just really focus on golden source and the controls around golden source. And once you do that, then the benefit will be endless, because if we're really taking from the golden source, then at the end of the day, it'll be more cost effective for the firm. But my answer to that is just talk to the checkbook people and make sure you can help define what a resource need is, be it both human and IT.
Thank you very much. I hope the checkbook people are listening in today then. Okay, excellent. Peter, coming to you, what should the broker-dealers be doing?
I mean, obviously, there are a lot of firms with millions of accounts, and there's a big ongoing sort of an initial cleanup effort and review process that probably needs to happen to make sure you're not swamped on day one. But I think the infrastructure side of it is something that if you don't put in place the tools people need to manage this process on a going forward basis, that is something that's going to be harder to deal with quickly. So people really need to be focused on that sort of infrastructure and technology component to make sure that they're putting in place the processes and the systems they need to manage this on an ongoing basis.
Thank you. And Marissa.
So to add on to what Denise and Peter have said, I would say if you haven't figured out your case reporting plan, you have to do that, whether you're building that in-house or you're expecting to lean on your clearing firm or you need to partner with a vendor. You need to have that plan, and you need to have that plan now. So you should be having those conversations. And then I would also say that we are all in this boat together. So, leverage industry, leverage your peers, right? Like we should come up with a collective best practices to the extent that that's possible, because this is brand new to everybody. And if we each try to interpret everything independently, we're going to make it harder for everybody, I think.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. And Jackie, some last words for you on what should be happening now.
Yes, I'd echo everything that everyone has said, and add in that if you haven't yet reviewed the spec and the additional guidance, which there are a lot of FAQs and some additional decks and webinars published by FINRA CAT, I would review them now very carefully to make sure you have an understanding of what it means for your firm and how it applies to your accounts and other FDIDs that you report. And as Marissa said, we're all in this together, so really get involved with some of the industry discussions and understand how other firms are reporting, so we can all hopefully get on a similar footing for the reporting on next July.
Okay, thank you. And thank you to all our speakers for sharing their expertise and experience. Thank you too to NTIA for sponsoring today's webinar. It's been an interesting conversation and in some places quite complicated for me, but I think very helpful to our audience. Okay, before we close up, just a few A-Team group items that may be of interest to you. We recently launched a new content service called ESG Insight, which is dedicated to environmental, social, and governance issues, including data sourcing, data management, standards, risk reporting, regulation, and everything around ESG. You can register for this new service using the link on your screen, or just go to our main A-Team Insight website and you'll be able to find it there. So there's a lot up there already, so please do join us on that channel. Also, if you scroll down to additional options, you can download our ESG Handbook 2021 or indeed our Regulatory Data Handbook 2020-21. But I would say that we've got a 2021-2022 Reg Data Handbook coming out very soon, so watch out for that too. Alternatively, you can register for next week's RegTech Summit virtual. That's it for today. So thank you again to Marissa, Jackie, Denise, and Peter. And thank you to all of you taken part in the webinar. Please complete our feedback form, as we're always keen to hear your views and improve our products. Meantime, thanks again and goodbye.